Hello, I'm David Gibson, Director of the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University, and together with my colleague, Julie Gaffney, Executive Director of Fordham's Center for Community Engaged Learning, we want to welcome you all to our event, Calling In versus Calling Out. This event is part of a series of programs and conversations that Fordham is hosting in order to focus on issues of speech and action related to the controversial topic often described simply as cancel culture or call out culture and its related phenomenon, deplatforming. It's really all about who gets to say what and when and what are the consequences for that. The issue is in the news almost every day now, but a galvanizing moment was the publication last year in Harper's Magazine of an open letter signed by more than 150 intellectuals and artists that decried a, quote, censoriousness that they said was taking over the culture. Well, we're fortunate today to have one of the distinguished signers of that letter with us, Professor Loretta Ross. My colleague, Julie Gaffney, will introduce Professor Ross and lead us through the rest of today's event. Julie, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, David, and welcome everyone to this webinar event. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Loretta J. Ross. Professor Ross is an activist, public intellectual, and scholar, and currently is a visiting associate professor at Smith College. She is the author of multiple books, including Reproductive Justice and Introduction, and Calling In the Call Out Culture, Detoxing Our Movement, due out in 2021. Professor Ross joined the women's movement in 1978 by working at the first rape crisis center in the country and learned about women's human rights, reproductive justice, white supremacy, and women of color organizing. She also researched and fought hate groups such as the KKK in the 1990s, founded a national center for teaching people about their human rights, and co-founded Sister Song. She is a principal partner with 14th Strategies Consultants, a public affairs strategic agency dedicated to helping organizations, universities, and corporations live up to the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution. Professor Ross speaks, trains, consults, and lectures on many issues, including reproductive justice, appropriate whiteness, human rights, violence against women, and calling in the call-out culture. She's appeared on CNN, BET, Lead Story, Good Morning America, and has been featured in the New York Times, the Huffington Post, and on CBS Sunday Morning, among others. This year, she started her own podcast, Dread Feminist. With that, I will turn it over to Professor Ross. We will have time for questions toward the end of this event, so please do enter any questions that you might have into our chat. And we ask that everyone keep the chat respectful at all times. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Professor Ross. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm trying to set my timer so that I don't go on and on and on. When you're a professional talker, you just start running your mouth and you don't have a real good idea of where your boundaries are. But I first want to say thanks for inviting me to Fordham. I have to honestly say that I wrote this book on calling in the calling out culture because of my grandson. About 10 years ago, he appeared to be totally incapable of answering his cell phone, even though I know every tweener knew how to use a cell phone, but he used to let all his calls go to voicemail. And finally, when I called him on it, he said, well, Grandma, get on Facebook. That's the way you reach me. So I obeyed orders. I got on Facebook, and it turns out that he migrated off, calling it for old fogies. And so I stayed on Facebook, and that's when I discovered how mean people were being to each other. I have to honestly say I was not aware of how people just seem to have no filters on social media. And so when I asked another young person, what is all of this going on? Why are people behaving in ways that I'm sure they don't behave in real life? And she said, oh, you mean the call out culture? And my first response was, you named it? I mean, this is a behavior y'all are proud of? And she kind of shrugged and walked away. And so about 6 years ago, I started researching it and finally finished a book last December called Calling in the Call Out Culture, because I felt that I had life experiences that could lend themselves to people learning how to call people in. As a rape survivor, incest survivor, I taught Black feminist theory to men who were incarcerated for raping and murdering women. And I was only 25 years old at the time. So I think that was my first calling in. And then 15 years later, I was monitoring hate groups with Reverend C.T. Vivian, who passed last summer, unfortunately. But my job at the National Anti-Klan Network, the Center for Democratic Renewal, was to deprogram white supremacists. And I found that once I got to know people who'd been in the Aryan Nations and the Ku Klux Klan, I couldn't hate them anymore. And because you begin to see them as human beings. And so I say that's the second biggest calling in moment that I had. Because really, if a Black woman can't hate the Klan, your hate list gets really, really short. And then I added to that the 50 years I've been doing social justice and human rights work within the women's movement. And as a Black feminist, teenage Black feminist coming into the movement, and I was so mouthy because I was always calling out the white feminists for not understanding Blackness and calling out Black men for not understanding sexism. I mean, this is what I did. And so fortunately, when this young person told me about the call out culture, it offered me a chance to rethink all the experiences that I'd had and why people didn't give up on insufferable me when I was a teenage activist. And so I wanted to package these lessons that I've learned in a format that was accessible to people. But I don't want to be a granny scold. I don't want to chastise people because the world that people are dealing with now is not the world that was there when I was becoming an activist. But I do want to offer some timeless lessons because I learned these lessons from people like Reverend C.T. Vivian or Congressman John Lewis or Ralph David Abernathy and Joseph Lowry, because these were the civil rights icons in Atlanta that I was fortunate enough to learn from. And one of the things they all told me was that the civil rights leaders used to fight like hell behind closed doors. Well, they didn't use the word hell, they were all ministers, but they fought behind closed doors. But they always presented a united front when they came outside those doors. And so they taught me how to disagree and still remain on the same team with each other. And that's what I wanted to offer people. My brand is Dread Feminist, named after Dred Scott, the 1857 Supreme Court decision that declared that Black people were only 3/5 of a human being for the purposes of the census count. And I noticed that no one had ever dreaded up the women's signal, so that became my brand. I am part of the human rights movement. Many of you may not realize that in his last Sunday sermon before he was assassinated, which was March 31st, 1968, Dr. King called on us to build a US-based human rights movement that was focused on the human rights violations committed in the United States and by the United States. And as a matter of fact, when I first heard this insight from Reverend Vivian, I was so surprised. I mean, everybody told me Dr. King had a dream, but nobody told me Dr. King had a plan. And so that's why I've been dedicated ever since that moment to building that US-based human rights movement. Even as I work on different issues, I still want to bring it back home to human rights because I'm at least smart enough to listen to Dr. King. But because I'm a feminist, I'm part of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement. I care about racial justice, so I'm part of the civil rights wing of the human rights movement. I'm disabled, so I'm part of the disability rights wing. You've got what I mean. I don't have enough room to put enough arrows for all the social justice causes that are part of the human rights movement, but human rights congregates all of our movements together so that we don't remain siloed. And basically, what I think is most important for the human rights framework is that instead of just defining ourselves based on what we fight against, we have an opportunity to define what we're fighting for. I mean, we really need to be clear that we have to have a plan and a strategy for if we win, because if we don't have a plan and a strategy for which we win and a value system to undergird that victory, then we may end up just having fought for our equal opportunity to oppress other people. So I'm really insistent that we understand the power of the human rights framework, the unifying strategy that it offers us, and the fact that for hundreds of years, Black people have been demanding that the United States become a human rights-based country. Frederick Douglass used the phrase human rights in 1858. 90 years before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written. And so if America ever learns to listen to Black people, we may want to build this US-based human rights movement that brings all of our issues together instead of working like we're competing ions with each other. I want to start with some definitions. I think we all know what calling out is. That's basically showing off your knowledge to publicly shame or humiliate somebody for what they say, what they believe, what they wear, for not being as woke as you think they should be. Calling on is that intermediate step. It's where you're not willing to necessarily invest in somebody else's growth, either by calling them out or calling them in, because you're not ready to do that emotional labor, but you are calling on them to be a better human being. And my favorite calling on sentence is, I beg your pardon. And I just look at them and let that sentence lay there while they rethink in their own heads what they said. And quite often they'll back up and come at it a different way. Now, calling in is the most emotionally laborious set of skills that you can learn because you're trying to figure out how to have these difficult dialogues with others at the same time you respect their human rights and respect how different they are from you. And they are going to have different perspectives because they have different experiences. Privileges, we all have privilege. We often talk about white privilege, but there's such things as male privilege. I actually think there's a such thing as Black privilege because I'm so happy to be a Black person. But anyway, it's advantages that one is not responsible for. You did not give yourself these privileges, but you need to be accountable for having them. And unfortunately, we have a tendency to weaponize privilege where we use the knowledge, our identity, or our status to dominate others, knowing that they can't punch back. And the victimized violator is a term I created when I did my human rights education work, recognizing that everyone is capable of violating someone else's human right, even as their rights are violated. So think of the victim of racial injustice who's also homophobic, or the victim of transphobia who's also misogynist, and on and on and on. That victimized violator position is what gets us into a lot of call outs, and that's what I want to talk about today. There is a debate on whether or not performance activism should be called out. I frankly don't believe so, but there are people who think that people are only doing symbolic actions and they're trying to virtue signal that they're so woke or they're so hip, and they want to signal to others how they're standing up for the right thing, mainly to get approval from others. Now, the reason that I don't criticize performativity or performance activism by individuals is because as a person who believes in a doctrine of calling in, I don't necessarily know what's going on with that person. So if all they can do is put a Black Lives Matter sign on their Facebook profile, I'm going to accept that as a win. I'm not going to say, well, you should be doing more and I want you to do this, that, and that, because I don't know if that's all that they can do. If you haven't done the work to find out any facts, you're really not entitled to an opinion to make a judgment about a situation that you don't know. But what I do know about the person putting that Black Lives Matter sign up on their website is at least they're not on the other side. So I'm going to take that as a win. And of course, a lot of people use their identities to bully other people, uh, claiming that, well, I am a rape survivor, so I get a right to hurt people because I've been hurt myself, kind of approach. And they want to silence sometimes and dominate others. And sometimes they wrap that victimhood mantle so securely around themselves that they've yet to form an identity that's not based on their trauma and victimization. And so they end up concretizing their victimization because that's what they know and that's what they believe will protect them. And of course, I define pivots and deflections as ways people use to avoid talking about a difficult conversation or being be made to feel uncomfortable or being held accountable. I also want to talk about the difference between punching up, punching down, and punching sideways. Punching up is what the human rights movement does. We basically use the power of public shame and embarrassment to hold people or other entities accountable because they're abusing their power over people through their clout, their privilege, their social or their economic power, or their celebrity status. Sometimes these people are unreachable by any other means, so we have to punch up. We have to call them out because they've been offered a chance to change, but they refuse to change. Punching down is what I hope none of us do. That's taking advantage of our own power, our own status, our own whatever, and to harm people who are below us in that status, knowledge, or power. And we commit that harm against them and get away with it because they cannot hold us accountable. And punching sideways, though, that's what we mainly do in the progressive movement. We take pot shots at those who are relatively at the same power level that we're at, even though there be differences of identity, but still we think that we know the right way to do social justice work, and we're going to criticize everybody else who doesn't do it our way, which of course is a losing strategy. But I want to start this conversation with some context in which the calling out culture is occurring. When France gifted us the Statue of Liberty on the right, they were celebrating the fact that the Civil War had purportedly ended slavery. And so they wanted to celebrate the end of slavery by marking her feet with the broken chains of slavery. So a lot of people know about the Statue of Liberty, but they didn't know that she had broken chains around her feet. And unfortunately, the question of whether the United States is going to be the country living up to its promise of liberty or the country in thrall to people who want to practice the remnants of slavery has yet to be decided. And we saw that on January 6th at the US Capitol, when we saw this white supremacist noose at the Capitol, when by protesters who weren't claiming that their votes didn't get counted or that they were getting killed. They were protesting the counting of Black votes that cost them the election. And so that question of whether or not we're going to be dedicated to the enfranchisement and liberty of all Americans, or will the privileges of this country, like voting, only be reserved for white Americans, is still not solved. I live in the state of Georgia, where we just passed the most draconian anti-voting rights bill in the country. And yet the people, Brian Kemp, our governor, who passed the bill, is claiming that, oh, we're being canceled. Major League Baseball is canceling us. It's a leftist outrage posse. Well, yeah, we're outraged because you do not want to share democracy and you'd rather deconstruct democracy than share it. And so, of course, you hear the right always talking about they're being canceled because their only strategy is to practice white grievance politics and to claim that white men are the victims of the system and try to continue the Civil War. Uh, Unfortunately, we're in the 21st century. Unfortunately for them, we're in the 21st century, not the 19th. But I think they want to refight the Civil War and see if they have another chance of winning it. But if we had satisfactorily handled the traitors in 1865 who broke our country in two and killed hundreds of thousands of people, if we had handled those traitors in 1865, we wouldn't have seen the Confederate flag in the Capitol in 2021. And unfortunately, all of this was eminently predictable because Ulysses S. Grant, who became president 4 years after Lincoln was assassinated, he faced many insurrections by the Confederates from the South who were trying to continue the Civil War. And he said, if we're to have another Civil War, I predict that the dividing line will not be Mason and Dixon's, but between patriotism and intelligence on the one side and superstition, ambition, and ignorance on the other. And that's exactly the American dilemma. That those of us who do believe in the promise of this country are the true patriots, and we're trying to use evidence, facts, and intelligence to preserve a democracy, fighting against the forces of superstition like QAnon, naked, opportunistic political ambition like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, and not to mention Gates, anyway, and ignorance on the other. The way that a large part of the white voting public can be manipulated by their grievance against people of color and immigrants and LGBTQ people and on and on. And they're almost being decidedly ignorant. And I want to bring it to this conversation Karl Popper, who was an Austrian scientist, or he actually wrote a lot on the philosophy of science. And he observed in 1945, right at the conclusion of World War II, that ignorance is not a simple lack of knowledge, but an active aversion to knowledge. The refusal to know issuing from cowardice, pride, or laziness of mind. No rational argument will have a rational effect on a man who does not want to adopt a rational attitude. And unfortunately, here we are more than 50 years later, almost 70 years after he said this. 71 years after he said this, I guess, we're still fighting people who do not want to adopt a rational attitude. And there's still a question of whether it's coming from cowardice, pride, or laziness of mind. I also have a word for it. It's called white supremacy. So that brings me into the conversation around blame versus responsibility, because no one alive can be blamed for the creation of the system of white supremacy that we're in. It's like a toxic sea in which we're all swimming, and once in a while we'll swallow a gulp of that salt water against our will. But even though we're not responsible for erecting the system, we are responsible for ending that system. And the analogy I use is similar to the one that Isabel Wilkerson used in her book, Cast. Let's say that you just bought a house and you're very proud of this house and you're going to have a house party to show off to your friends and family and neighbors how proud you are of this house that you just bought. But when you bought this house, it contained bad plumbing. Now, you can't be blamed for the fact that the plumbing had been neglected for many years before you bought this house. It is not your fault. But if you're going to occupy that house, it is your job to fix the damn plumbing. And so that's the difference between blame, thinking that it's your fault, and responsibility, owning the fact that if you're going to enjoy that house, or if we're going to enjoy the privileges of living in the United States, we all bear the responsibility for ending the unjust system of white supremacy so that we can actually realize the dream that this country can promise. So within the calling in continuum, there are the three states, as I talked about. Calling out, which is publicly shaming people. Calling on, which is an invitation to people to rethink what they said or what they did. And calling in, which is to make an investment into another person's growth and help them see things a different way. And I'll be talking in detail about number 1 and 3, because I think you understand calling on. Calling on is just say, I expect you to do better. And then you decide whether you're going to stay there or walk away. So calling out is criticizing another's social justice practices. Generally speaking, though, the critics are never quite critical of their own practices because they think they're doing everything right. It's everybody else that's wrong. And they weaponize their knowledge against other people. And they think that they're in some kind of woke competition and want to punish or banish people for not being woke enough. But to a seasoned activist like me, the fact that you think that there's a woke competition really reveals how unwoke you actually are. And so you need to be very careful indulging in this woke competition because some of us want to wonder whether you're naive or whether you're a provocateur trying to break us apart. And they use the social justice movement not only to boost their ego, but they tend to want to use the social justice movement as their personal therapy space as well, or to uplift their standing in the community. And they wrongly think that we're supposed to have political purity of opinions in our social justice and human rights spaces, and they're willing to shame or bully people into agreeing with them. Now, Ta-Nehisi Coates quite acutely and astutely observes that calling out is being criticized right now for a particular reason. Any sober assessment of this history must conclude that the present objections to cancel culture are not so much concerned with the weapon as the kind of people who now seek to wield it. Until recently, cancellation flowed exclusively downward, punching down, as I said, from the powerful to the powerless. But now in this era of fallen gatekeepers, and I know we have fallen gatekeepers, and if you look at the miserable job mainstream media does of keeping us informed, where anyone with a Twitter handle or a Facebook account can be a publisher, banishment has been ostensibly democratized. So anybody with a keyboard has a voice right now, and they are using it to call attention to a lot of injustices people would rather not know about. And if you have a cell phone, you can document the routine uh, police brutality that's taking place in our country. But there are appropriate uses of call out to address power disparities when people are inaccessible to you and can't be reached in another way. If you want to avoid increasing the harm that people experience, and maybe you want to do it through private or public means, that's a good use of calling out. It also helps you to build community to find others who experience similar harms and maybe prevent future harms, as well as spreading information. It can help you also expose uh, hidden vulnerabilities or structures. Almost every school that I do a lecture in has a black at controversy. And the school administrators are deathly afraid of these black at controversies because they think that they're being called out. But in fact, what happens is that this is an opportunity who, to look at those unmarked or hidden structures of privileges that you can get ahead of and correct. And particularly they're bothered when the current students have a black at controversy, and then they start hearing from alumna for 30 years ago who say, well, that was the same when I was at that school. And so it shows that these structures are so well hidden or they're so traditional that there's been no effort to deconstruct them. And these historically silenced voices are going to use their keyboards to call people out, part of in pain, some partly in outrage. And it particularly works when public shaming does work. So if you're going to rethink the calling out culture, you've got to first avoid thinking in a binary between us versus them. You have to be clear about your motives and why are you doing it? Why were you calling people out in the first place? And can you risk thinking about calling people in? You need to prioritize your strategy because it's terrible to have an unfortunate or ill-timed call out blow up your own strategy because you failed to keep in mind the outcomes that you wanted to achieve or the collaboration that you needed to build. And it starts by avoiding shame and ousting as punishment of others, but figuring out other strategies because you need to value the relationships that are necessary to build power together. So this is what I call understanding your circles of influence or your don't waste your time analysis that I offer to you. Most of us who do human rights work are what I call 90 percenters. Not because we're 90% of the population, but because we have a very high level of unity, a high level of agreement amongst ourselves. And that high level of agreement is indicated by the fact that we have our familiar buzzwords that we use: racism, capitalism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, nativism, xenophobia. We could just name it on and on and on, ableism and on. The problem as 90 percenters is that we spend too much calling out of each other, trying to turn us into 100 percenters, under the mistaken belief that our politics must perfectly align for us to work together. But in fact, that 10% disagreement is supposed to be there. We're building a human rights movement, which is many different people thinking many different thoughts and moving in the same direction. If we were building a human rights cult, then we'd have a lot of different people thinking one thought and moving in the same direction. And so our diversity is actually our strength. Like, I am part of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement. I may not be working on indigenous rights, but I understand that they're part of the same human rights movement. Outside of the 90 percenters are the 75 percenters. These are the people who overlay with us and share with us a certain amount of our values, even if they don't use our elitist language to claim it. So they may not be talking about neoliberal capitalism, but they understand that America is not a great functioning democracy, and they want to participate in saving it. For me, as a feminist who works on reproductive justice and abortion rights, for example, my 75% group might be the Girl Scouts. Not because they are going to bring people to defend clinics or anything like that. I wish they would, but they don't. But they're 75 percenters to me because they believe in women and girls empowerment. And that's enough of a shared agenda for me to see them as my allies, not my opponents, even as they're repelled by the elitist language that we tend to use within our 90% bubble. Like they can't give you an analysis of neoliberal capitalism and individual reproductive choice and why it's bad and stuff like that, nor should they have to. Outside of the 75 percenters or the 50 percenters, the 50 percenters would be people like my parents. My father was a Jamaican immigrant, fairly conservative, and so he was uber patriotic because he served in the military for 26 years, was a member of the National Rifle Association, and really didn't understand why his daughter ended up doing human rights and social justice work. But we got along. I mean, I was one of 8 kids, so I'm sure that they had to just accept that one of their kids was not just going to fit into society. She was going to try to change it. My mom was a Southern evangelical Christian woman who believed in preachers and faith healers. And my mom and I really didn't have a lot of common conversations together because I was so radically different than anything she was used to. And so the way I broke the ice with my mom one day was that I reminded her of how she had started a Girl Scout troops for Black girls, because at the time in Southern Texas, we weren't allowed to join the white Girl Scout troops. And I said, Mom, do you remember how you used to make us feed the hungry people every weekend, the homeless people and the hungry? And of course she remembered that. I said, well, Mom, I'm a human rights activist. And so while you're a humanitarian and you feed the hungry, I'm a human rights activist. So I want to ask why they're hungry in the first place. With that one conversation, I got my mom to understand what work I do and why I do it. Because I was showing her that I live her values out in a different way. It's not that I disagree with the values. Those same family values she gave me are still alive in the work that I do. And that's the way we need to talk to many 50%ers. We need to go underneath what we think are their words or their belief system and ask them really about where our shared value systems are. My father believed in hard work and honor and things like that. And I could talk to him about that stuff if I stopped calling everybody in the military pigs in the service of imperialism kind of thing. And so we need to be strategic about, as 90%ers, how we can work with the 75 and the 50s. Outside of the 50s are the 25%ers that I most likely call Trump supporters, people who may not be personally racist, sexist, or transphobic or homophobic, but they supported somebody who was. So there's a real question of why they chose to hold their nose and not scrape them off. I don't think we have enough of a shared worldview with the 25%ers to come from our 90% position and offer any persuasion that they're going to hear or listen to, because one of the things that's common about all humanity is that they only listen to people that they trust. And I don't think they will ever have enough trust in us to listen to them, but it's worth a try. But outside of the 25%ers are the zeros. The zeros are people who are proud to be haters, proud to be white supremacists, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, even though they'll busily proclaim that I'm not a racist, I'm not this, I'm not that. Well, then why do you think it's okay to bring guns to stand in front of the voting booth so that you can just express your First Amendment and Second Amendment freedoms at the time somebody's trying to vote or live peacefully in their homes or whatever and stuff? Again, we have no opportunity to persuade these people. So that's why I call it the don't waste your time strategy. What we should be doing is the 90%ers need to be working with the 75%ers and exerting our influence there. The 75%ers can be persuaded to work with the 50%ers. And sometimes the 50%ers have inroads and commonality, like the people at my mom's church or the people at my father's American Legion Hall, who can work with the 25%ers. The 25%ers, if they cared to, could have a moderating influence on the 0%ers. But what our bad strategy is that we try to leap over all of those layers and think that we're going to be able to flip a 25 and a 0%er, particularly if they're in our family, and it doesn't work. And the tragedy of the last 50 years of American politics and history, instead of the ideas going from the left and the right and expanding our ideas of liberty and freedom, all of the influence has been going from the right to the left. So that the ideas of the far right and the Ku Klux Klan, the hatred of immigrants, the hatred of women, the hatred of LGBT folk, the nativism, the America Firstism, the anti-Semitism, all the things that we should not be entertaining as conversations in our society have become mainstream public policy because the right is sophisticated enough to know that they can take people suffering seriously and speak to them. And so we've made a strategic mistake, spending all of our time organizing to fight while our opponents organize for power. So if you're going to work from the 50 to the 90% circle of influence, you first got to stop by overstating the harm that you experience, that they do, and all of that. Sometimes they're just people with differences of opinion. You also have to take their suffering seriously and try to really understand how they landed where they landed in their opinions. And that requires what I call the Uncle Frank strategy. My Uncle Frank strategy is based on your understanding how to set aside your reaction to somebody's words so that you actually get underneath those words and find out what's really going on with that person. So my Uncle Frank strategy is for the uncle or the relative or the aunt who generally says something outrageous at the dinner table. And what predictably happens is that either somebody jumps down their throat for saying it, or everybody buries their head in their plate and tries to pretend it didn't happen. But my Uncle Frank strategy requires you to just look at Uncle Frank and say, Uncle Frank, I'm your niece. You know I love you. And what I love about you, Uncle Frank, is that I know how good and kind a man you actually are. I know that you would drive 20 miles in the middle of the night to give somebody a jump on their battery if their car was dead. I know you would rush into a burning building and save somebody if you could, and you wouldn't care what race or gender or who they slept with. I know you, Uncle Frank. I know you're a good man. So, Uncle Frank, help me understand how such a good man that I know you are, a kind man that I know you are, would have those kind of words coming out of his mouth. Tell me, how am I supposed to reconcile the good Uncle Frank with the mean Uncle Frank? How is that working for you? But mostly, how am I supposed to deal with you when I'm looking at the man that I could love versus the man who scares me? When you do that kind of strategy, what you're trying to do is help them build their kindness muscle and take control of how they want to walk through the world. Because Uncle Frank may not want his niece to have a lowered opinion of him. And yet, if he doesn't feel heard and respected, he will not self interrogate the choices that he makes about the opinions that he holds. And so that's what I call the Uncle Frank strategy. You can work with anybody that you actually know because you can point out their good side and what you admire about them and ask them to self contrast how, if that's how they want to walk through the world. Sometimes you can offer factual explanations for people suffering, but it does require to create and normalize a calling in culture. You have to, like with Uncle Frank, you have to first assure him that you're not going to jump down his throat. You're really literally mean, tell me more. And when you create that atmosphere of trust, then you lessen their chances of wanting to jump the defensiveness. And you can also do it through a spirit of creating joy, of belonging to the human rights movement, because I'm here to say, after 50 something years of doing this work, that if you're not having fun and if you're not experiencing joy in doing righteous work, then you're doing something wrong. That doesn't mean the work is not going to be hard and it won't challenge you and that you won't make mistakes, but you should be having fun living on the right side of righteousness. And if you're not, then there's something you need to check about yourself about how you're doing this work. And generally, with the Uncle Franks, you can find experiences that resonate with them, that you know about them, and share with them and reinforce their positive values. But it does require you to avoid name calling or calling out tactics when you weaponize your knowledge or language against them. So to decide who is your 75 to 50%, who works on the issues that are adjacent to the things you care about? Who do you have relationships with who don't necessarily share your precise political perspectives? But like I said, I know people who are Girl Scout troop leaders, so I may want to work with them if I want to work on women's rights together. Who's necessary? If I want to do educational reform and address how the digital divide is harming students who have to sit in the parking lots of Taco Bell to get a Wi-Fi signal, then I need to figure out how I'm going to work with people who are the decision makers around that digital divide. And that requires being strategic and identifying your potential allies and not defining them as opponents or enemies, simply because they may be in that 75 or 50% circle. You can also ask yourself, who would you like to develop relationships with? Who's not in the circle with you that you think you want to develop relationship with, not to pull them into the 90% circle. Let them stay where they are. But that doesn't mean that you can't have a relationship with them. And then you can also take advantage of opportunities for calling in. I get asked a lot of times, well, how do you call somebody in when people are being mean on social media? I said, it's called speaking up. Well, then they'll all attack me. Okay. So you speak up some more, or you choose to stop doom scrolling and disengage. I think calling in becomes all of our responsibility to do because we can learn to be in a position to offer grace, forgiveness, and respect to others. And there are people who value your work, but works on it in a different way, the same way with me and my mom. So we've got to learn this growth mindset through calling in. And calling in is simply a calling out done with love. You are still seeking accountability as you would be with calling out, but you are using a strategy that's more likely to achieve accountability because you're going to do it with respect and love. To be honest, every human being is not going to admit they made a mistake if they're going to be have someone jump down their throat for making that admission. They are much more likely to own their mistakes and seek to do better if they know they won't be punished for it for telling the truth. So you actually increase the likelihood of accountability rather than decrease it when you use calling in. And it starts by giving each other the benefit of the doubt, just like I talked about giving the benefit of the doubt to the woman who all I could see was putting up a Black Lives Matter sign on her website. And I don't know if she's done anything else, but giving others the benefit of the doubt means that you're accepting that other people are at least as complicated as you are. I mean, why simplify them based on what you think they said or what you think they mean when you would not want anybody to do that to you? And that we're actually supposed to have different ideas because we're diverse people on the same team. In the team I'm calling the human rights movement, but it could be your college, your university, your church, your school, whatever. And we're supposed to have difference of opinion. That's what a pluralistic society has. And we always have to remember the broader context. I really hate those gotcha moments, trying to hold people accountable for something they did while they were very young, and then you want to gotcha with the got to them on it decades later. I mean, everybody was a stupid teenager at some point, and we're just lucky that someone didn't have a cell phone recording our every faux pas just to hold it over our heads like the sword of Damocles decades later. And this requires using those active, loving listening practices that we can learn in a whole lot of different settings and being grateful that we have this opportunity to grow together, develop a growth mindset, and do better together. So calling in begins with self-assessment. First of all, you have to analyze how you feel and why you want to call somebody in. If you're not in a sufficiently healed place to have a difficult conversation, then you need to stop and assess whether or not you're going to call somebody in or not. Because if your wounds are still gaping open and you don't feel like you've got the patience to have an uncomfortable conversation, or you can't put your reaction to what somebody has said or done in that mental parking lot while you pay good attention to them, then it's okay. You don't have to call people in. It's not an obligation. Because if you're in that space where you're not healed enough, then your first priority needs to be yourself. It is not obligatory to extend emotional energy to another person. But you do have to accept that you don't have the power to change others. You're not that magical super being who can just Tell somebody how you feel and make them instantly change. If that were a magical superpower available, I'm sure couples wouldn't fight, families wouldn't fight, schools wouldn't fight, et cetera, et cetera. So you could only take responsibility for the fact that you offered love and respect, not for somebody else's inability to accept it. And you may still disagree, but that's okay. We're supposed to have differences of opinion. And I believe the second step after self-assessment the second step is learning to forgive yourself for your previous mistakes. In my calling in trainings, the one thing I always ask my students with my online trainings is, when you were a child and you made a mistake, how were your mistakes handled? Were you severely punished for your mistakes? Were you publicly shamed for making a mistake? Because if those kinds of experiences happened to you as a child when you made a mistake, that probably increases the chance that you feel others should be punished and shamed for their mistakes. So that childhood imprint is the pattern that you're going to use as an adult. But if when you were a child and your mistakes were seen with love and grace and you were counseled and how to handle mistake, how to learn from them, then you're going to be predisposed to forgive others and give them the benefit of the doubt and to help them learn from their mistakes. So in calling in trainings, so what I'm trying to get people to do is understand that they have choices. They don't have to just live to the patterns that they learned as children, and actually can do something different today. So to understand calling in, you've got to understand that our goal is to decrease harm over time. It's not the job of victim survivors to teach somebody else who can harm them. It must be voluntary, but it starts with separating a person's behaviors from their values. Just because somebody says something you think is problematic or hurtful, that doesn't mean they're a mean, ugly, hateful person that you need to hurt. It does require familiarity with discomfort, because a bridge builder, by definition, is going to be a very invisibilized person who has to be able to build a container to hold people who have different opinions and experiences. You also need to understand the taxonomy of calling out. Natalie Wynn is a wonderful woman who has analyzed the 7 stages of cancel culture magnification. First of all, instead of a presumption of innocence, there's a presumption of guilt. So we'll start off with a statement like, Joe said something racist at the meeting today. And then that gossip will spread so fast and get so quickly abstracted. The next time you hear anything about Joe, it's not that Joe said something racist, it's that Joe must be a racist, because then this has been attached to his moral character. That's the essentialist part of it. And then when you repeat it, it's of course Joe is a racist, because I know what racism is and I can tell it. And so you're going to use your highfalutin moralism or intellectualism to definitively proclaim that Joe is a racist. And obviously you're a good person working against that evil person, Joe, because you believe that good people work against evil people, and you can call them like you see them using that false binary. And poor Joe, he's in a quandary. He said something that somebody thought was racist. It may not have been intended as racist, but somebody else thought it was racist. So now he's in a position of wanting to apologize. But if he apologizes as sincerely as he can, people are going to think that he's insincere and he's gaming the system. But if he doesn't apologize, then people are going to think that he's evading accountability. And then there's an unforgettability about what poor Joe is going through. That will always be a stain on him. It's like the internet never forgets. Well, you know, Joe the racist kind of thing becomes part of his appellation, I guess. And then poor Joe gets the political cooties, because if you hang out with Joe and if you have dinner with Joe, or if you cite Joe's work, then you must be a racist too. that's the cancel culture, call out culture magnification. So it ends up replicating the carceral system that we call ourselves fighting. It discourages people from activism. It frightens people into not speaking up for fear that they'll be pounced on next. And it often drives people away from the movement. While it disguises privileges by weaponizing language, it decreases accountability because it makes it very hard to achieve it. It also increases harm rather than healing. And you have to gaslight people in a calling out culture, devaluing their experiences, and you actually end up isolating people rather than unifying them. And you create a culture of cynicism and hopelessness. But since I'm over time, I'm going to stop the share right now and leave time for Q&A. And thank y'all for listening to me. I should say before I totally turn it over that I teach calling in techniques online, and you can find out the enrollment for my classes. Each class is only $5. The complete set of classes is only $20. And my next class starts June 1, and you can look at lorettajross.com and find them. And that's for everybody, the general audience class. And then I have another class starting April 21st for the African American Black community, which is also $5 or $20 for the set. And that starts April 21st. So if you want to learn these techniques of calling in and practice on them, please come to my online classes. And thank you all for listening to me.
Well, thank you so much, Loretta, for this talk. And I can see in the chat that there's been a lot of engagement and a lot of folks listening and responding to what you have shared with us today. So grateful to have you with us. And we do have a number of questions I see in the chat. Maybe I'll kick us off with one that came in early on. What do you believe the relationship is between the persistence of bigotry and structures of capitalism?
Well, I think capitalism profits off bigotry, which is why it's so well maintained. But I've also seen a lot of bigotry in pre-capitalist formations too. So I don't want to attribute all bigotry to capitalism. I mean, anti-Semitism was monetized on the Iberian Peninsula in the 10th and 11th century in the fights between Portugal and Spain. And so that was when they had a trading relationship with Africa versus a piracy and plunder one, which Portugal decided to change. And so they used anti-Semitism and weaponized that as a way to compete for power and influence and stuff. So there's a lot of ways that bigotry is profitable under different economic systems.
Absolutely. Another question that came in is on the term, and I've heard you speak a bit about the term anti-racism. One of our faculty members wrote in, I would love to hear Dr. Ross's thoughts on the Robin DiAngelo style anti-racist workshops.
Well, I appreciate what Robin DiAngelo does. I appreciate what Ibram Kendi does. I think that they are specialists in a particular way that isn't my way, but I'm not going to call them out for it. Robin works on a very personalized status around white fragility, and I appreciate that work. I tend to do work that I call appropriate whiteness. So instead of focusing on white fragility, I focus on white courage, because I think being ashamed of being white is not helpful. And I'm really tired of our movement being used as that public therapy space to get over the shame and guilt of being white, when in fact there's ways to exhibit and lineages of white courage. I mean, even as they were constructing white supremacy in this society, there are white people opposed to the slavery system. There are white people opposed to the genocide. There are white people who gave their lives and lived their lives opposed to white people, but we're carefully not taught about those people in our history books. The only person we ever taught about is John Brown, and he got hanged. And so like, that's an object lesson for you, white folks. Don't stand up against white supremacy because you'll end up like John Brown kind of thing. Right? And yet, you know, I've known many white people who have struggled good against white supremacy, like Ann Braden and Mav Segrist and Suzanne Farr and Chip Burley. I mean, I know a lot of Leonard Seskin, my mentor, Shula Mith-Koenig, Israeli American who stood up for Palestinians and taught me a lot about human rights and stuff. I know them, but the history books aren't being written about these people so that the role models are out there for white people the same way we have the Kings and the Lewises and the Abernathys to stand up for us. And it's intentional because you can replicate the system of white supremacy if white people don't understand that there's another way that they could be in the world.
That makes sense to me. Yeah. And thank you for that. I'm going to invite a student, Ian, to join us now. I know that he has a question or two. Welcome, Ian.
Hi, Loretta. Hi, Julie. Thank you so much for being here. I mean, this whole talk, I was snapping and clapping, and I had notes, Post-it notes all around my computer that I was writing down. One thing that you talked about was that calling in is not obligatory and that mental well-being is more important, especially for people who come from marginalized identities who have experienced or are experiencing trauma. And that's what a lot of people have responded to me in my circles when I ask about engaging in discourse with people who don't believe the same things as you. So another element of cancel culture, I think, especially in this recent election cycle, has been on adding people who don't agree with you. And kind of what I think in my mind, it's self-polarization. It's willful. It's adding to the polarization that's driven by social media algorithms. So how do you respond to like that element specifically of cancel culture?
Well, again, it depends on their relationship to you. Because if you have a relationship to the person, again, you can use my Uncle Frank's strategy, because you know them well enough to know that they have a good side, right? And you can build up on the good side and get them to address their own internal cognitive dissonance. Why are you so good inside, but you behave or think this on the outside, kind of thing? So if you know them, you have some avenues for working. If they're strangers, then you need to decide how much of an investment you want. So you might use the calling on strategy first, because they're strangers to you, and their response to your calling on them will determine whether you need to call them out or call them in. That's where they can decide your path for you after that. And that's only assuming that you've got the time and inclination and interest to do so. Because again, it's not obligatory. You get to choose whether you're going to invest in somebody else's emotional growth. And I know that a lot of white people flinch when they want to learn more about white supremacy and racial justice or gender justice or whatever, and they start off by saying, "Oh, can you tell me more? Can you educate me?" And so they get a fierce rebuff when that happens, because it's kind of like, you've got a test tomorrow and you want to cram 400 years worth of studying in my response. Excuse me, you had 400 years to study for this damn test. And so can you imagine the response that we let? You want me to take my time to help you cram for the test tonight just because George Floyd got killed, right? I mean, that's the emotional response of people. And so, but you can ask and then accept that they say, no, I'm not in a space, but you can ask again, somebody else. And, somebody might be me who says, yes, I'm in that emotional space. So you can't take it personal when they don't say, yes, I'm here to be at your beck and call and do to be your cliff notes for white supremacy. And there's, of course, all kinds of information available on the internet. So if you really are passionate about it, then you don't actually need someone to guide you. You're just trying to get a shortcut. You didn't do the 400 years worth of studying, so you want me to give you a cheat sheet. That's not going to work that well either, and stuff. So it depends on your relationship to them, whether or not you feel like investing in them or not. But another call-in technique that I teach is that a way to ask for help is to say, first of all, make it a question. What you said in the meeting today really piqued my interest. Do you have time for us to talk about it more now, or can we make an appointment to talk about it later? That way you've given the decision to the hands of the person that you're making the request of. You're not coming from a sense of entitlement, demanding that they give you their attention right now.
Excellent, excellent. I snaps.
Right? Like, yeah, you just don't act like you can, get my cheat notes for the test that you've had 400 years to study for.
Exactly, and I especially like your point that if someone was really passionate about learning about racism, about white supremacy, about how to be anti-racist, they could do the work themselves. And I mean, it's all out there. We have it at our fingertips.
Right.
I like that a lot.
Right. But somehow your pattern of entitlement makes you think that I'm supposed to drop my life and agenda and educate you.
Yeah. So another kind of a follow-up question that works really well with that is, you said earlier, you use the metaphor of the house from Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, which is awesome. I recommend to everyone else to read both Loretta's book and that one. That no one chooses to be born into this system of white supremacy. No one chooses to inherit this broken house. And you said that all people have a responsibility to do what they can in the spaces and the demographics that they're born into to deconstruct it. But I wonder, do you think that all people from all demographics have an equal responsibility? Or like a more direct question is, do you think that white people have a greater responsibility to be anti-racist, to engage in discourse, to call in order to deconstruct brick by brick this system of white supremacy that their ancestors, my ancestors, helped create?
Well, I don't know if I would do a greater than or less than responsibility. We're all human beings. We get to choose how our character is going to be. Your identity is just your identity. But just having a white identity doesn't by default mean that you're a white supremacist. Because as I said, all white supremacists ain't even white. And all white people ain't white supremacy. You're born human. So you get a choice to determine how you're going to walk through the world. Now, because you have a white identity, you will be afforded different ways on working on white supremacy than I do through a Black female white supremacy. So I don't know if I have a greater responsibility or you have a greater responsibility, or even if that's the equation we should be looking at. I think that is a very white kind of way of looking at it. It's like we all got a responsibility for being the best human beings we can be. And I don't see anybody having a less responsibility for that and stuff. So, I don't think you get a pass on being an awful human being because you have a certain identity.
Exactly.
And so I don't know if I would line it up in that linear, greater, lesser than, or anything. You have an opportunity to be all that you can be. And what I like about, in my white supremacy class, I teach this concept called appropriate whiteness. It's about how do you construct a white identity without the shame of being white. I want to talk about white pride in a way that the white racists don't mean it. What are you proud about for being white? What does it mean that your ancestors came over here not even speaking the damn language and made a way out of no way? Even though they were given advantages, they still had a lot of stamina to just pick up and come. I mean, I love the way white people are obsessed with time because I like planes that run on time. But I also get mad at it when it becomes a definer of how they relate to people. I can't deal with you because you're always late or whatever. I mean, really? So there are a lot of good things about every culture that taken to excess is a problem. The most conversational stopper I know among white people is to ask them what they like about being white. And they look at you as if you just farted. Because it's like, it's not a question they've ever considered before. But I could give you 15 reasons about what I like being Black, 75 about what I like being a woman, and 110 because I like being someone who likes, reggae music, and my dad's from Jamaica. I mean, I know these things about myself. Why you've never interrogated them for yourself is effective, is proof of the brainwashing of white supremacy.
Thank you so much. I certainly have never been asked that or asked myself, and appreciate it a lot. I think there's a lot of other questions in the chat, so I'll pass it back to Julie, but thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ian, thank you for joining us, and thanks for those questions. And I know we are running short on time. I just want to ask one more that I've seen. I think it was our first question that has been highlighted since, and of course, it's a question that I don't think anybody can answer in 5 minutes, but I'll pose it anyway. And so this is so when you're part of an institution that's not doing, and I think the person asking really is thinking about Fordham. When you're part of an institution that's not doing what they have stated they would do for human rights, or when they or when they do something that goes against what they said they were going to do, what should you do when you're part of the collective that doesn't make the decisions? I imagine when you're not part of the administration or you're not senior leadership, should you as a collective call out the institution?
Well, I mean, as a last resort, it shouldn't be your first strategy because, again, you've got to appreciate that you're all on the same team. I doubt there's anybody at Fordham who's there trying to fuck over Fordham. So it means you're all on the same team. Now, if you got somebody there who's trying to mess over the school, then you got a bigger problem. But if you're all on the same dang team and you got different responsibilities, just like I love football, so the quarterback is not going to have the same responsibility as the running back or the offensive tackle or the defensive tackle. You need to recognize how you're all on the same team with different responsibilities. So choose a calling in strategy based on that acknowledgement that you're all on the same team and you just got to figure out how to work better together. You're not enemies just because you have different responsibilities and different opinions. Now, what I find, having worked in higher education for the last 5 years, is that we all got these great mission statements that we're having trouble living up to around fighting racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever it is. And that's because of a couple of things. First of all, most liberals I know, white liberals I know, have this undercurrent of racial resentment that they haven't reconciled and stripped out of their soul. And so that's why they start grumbling when they go to a diversity and inclusion training. And they usually leave those bad trainings being more resentful than when they walked in. And we had that incident at Smith College with the woman that made a video and ended up on Tucker Carlson kind of thing. And so we had a whole program at Smith about the hidden racial resentment of liberalism, because we have to unearth this on our campus. I don't think we have avowed racists on campus, but we got a lot of white people who are uncomfortable around the question of racial justice, uncomfortable around their own whiteness, who silence themselves for fear of saying the wrong things, but they're like an anchor on change when we're trying to make it. I mean, I'll give you one example. We have decided to finally listen to a 30-year demand of the student body to have a dedicated course on race, mandatory for all first-year students. And the students of color have been asking for this for 30 years. So we're serious about it this year, right? And so I was just innocently asking, well, obviously this is going to put a pretty heavy load on all the faculty who teach on race, which is mainly faculty of color and stuff. And so what is the compensation system that y'all are thinking about to pay them for this extra work? Because our class size is about to go from 12 to 50. That's a big jump. When you got 600 people, you got to teach a course in a 2-semester period, right? That's the size of chemistry classes. I mean, I majored in chemistry and physics. I know what those big lab classes look like. And so I was told, I won't call them out, but I was told, well, Loretta, we've tried to compensate the faculty of color before for the unpaid labor that they do, but we were told that we couldn't do it because it's a matter of equity. The other professors would feel that they weren't being treated fairly. And so I told this person of power what I thought I heard them say. Are you basically telling me that the professors who aren't doing the work get to veto the pay of the people who do the work? Because they're feeling that they're getting treated unfairly. Under what system of capitalism do the non-workers get to veto the workers' pay? I mean, do you know another system of capitalism than the one I'm used to? You know? But it was a tradition to allow this veto power by mainly white professors that kept screwing over the professors of color. And then at the same time, they fuss that the professors of color won't step up to do even more work, as if they're just too lazy, kind of stuff. So those are the hidden tripwires within all of our schools that are traditions that no one interrogates with love. And I'm interrogating them not with anger, but with love, to let them know what you just said doesn't make sense. You've got double-dip PhDs. In what society do the non-workers get to dictate whether the workers get paid? I mean, where does that work? How does that work?
Absolutely.
You know, or the affirmative action officer has to clear every recommendation with a white person who's actually racist. What the hell? Isn't that the opposite of what affirmative action is supposed to be about? So you've given her the responsibility, but you kept the power with somebody else. We have a lot of those situations at our school. What's that? Yes, it's upholding white supremacy ideology, but it's internalized white supremacy. Because my college is full of liberals. I don't think we actually have any white supremacists. We got the occasional kid that would, paint a swastika on a building or stuff, but they're not the people in power doing that and stuff. So yeah, but we don't understand how we drank the toxin of white supremacy ourselves.
Absolutely. Another question that just came in, could you share your views on reparations and how America can create a nationwide plan?
Oh, I wish I could.
Yeah.
In theory, I support it, but I haven't done enough homework or research to know how it could actually be done. I do know that I've been embarrassed over that question once. I was at the preparatory conference for the World Conference Against Racism down in Chile. And at the World Conference Against Racism was designed to talk about reparations for the enslavement, around the world. It wasn't just, the US, but it was, South America, Central America, Africa, Europe. I mean, it was everybody coming together to talk about racism and how to address and compensate for it. And when I got to Chile, I was embarrassed because the US delegation came with our mouths and nothing else. Where the people from Brazil, the people from Chile, from Guatemala, from all parts of Africa, they bought binder books of what companies profited from it, what their yield was from it, what colleges and universities had been built with. I mean, they had evidence and details, and all we had was our mouths. And so we're way behind the rest of the world in having this conversation. And I admit I'm part of the people of the population that hasn't done that research, but I know it could be done. But it was embarrassing to sit up here like, well, we've got the book on the insurance companies, and this is what the banks and their history is, and and that tennis shoe manufacturer. Well, this is how they've exploited the worker for the last 50 years, and this is the underpayment that they've made of the workers, and blah blah blah. And that advertising company, this is how much they made by advertising this racist stuff and stuff like that. I mean, they had details, tones, and we had wolf tickets. So I'm kind of embarrassed about the U.S. reparations movement. If I were part of it, I'd make it a research collective. Now, there's books like the Ebony and Ivy book and other books where people are beginning to do that work, but the World Conference Against Racism was in 2001. We've had plenty of time to have a strategy and some high quality research around reparations so that we're not embarrassed when we go to these international fora.
That makes so much sense and really, resonates with me. And I will say, I know we have a lot of faculty and students who have tuned in today. And I think not to say that, the university has any kind of, answer here. However, this sounds to me like, taking a stab at kind of a project like this would be a fantastic way to build a community engaged learning course, to build a research project. And so, I'd love to continue that conversation with folks who are interested in partnering with the center, at least to kind of get the ball rolling and get where our international colleagues are, to at least get started.
And keep in mind that the United Nations is in the middle of an international decade for people of African descent. So you're right there in New York. You could, post-COVID, have conversations with people who could connect you with the people from the global South that can actually see. The problem with us as Americans is that we don't humble ourselves to learn from the global South, who are actually doing much better on a lot more issues than we are. And so we could actually, instead of trying to think we have to do it all over again, we could actually humble ourselves and learn from activists in other countries and figure out how they did it, even under more repressive regimes than ours, and see what we could do.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more, and I will.
I can stay till 5:30.
Is that okay? Thank you for that. I'll pull out one more question. Could you speak more on how to challenge narratives viewed through a trauma victim lens while honoring people's lived experiences?
Well, I have to speak personally about that because I'm both a rape and an incest survivor. And not only was I raped at 11, kidnapped from a Girl Scout outing, and fortunately wasn't left dead in the woods where I'd been kidnapped to, but I had an older cousin of mine, married older cousin, who was 27 and thought it was a good idea to get me drunk when I was 14 so that he could manufacture consent with me. And that not only did I have very, very inappropriate sex with him, but I ended up getting pregnant. And in the 60s, when you got pregnant, you didn't have a choice about whether you had the baby. Your only choice was whether to keep him or give him up for adoption. And I chose to keep my son. So before I was 15 years old, my life had been severely traumatized in a number of ways. And I had to have that conversation with myself at 14 and 15, whether I was going to let the things that had happened to me define who I was. And I'm doing a bit of historical revisionism because I wasn't clear like I am now, so many years later. But my mother said something about me that I'll never forget. When she sent me off to college at 16, she said, Loretta, what I really admire about you is that you don't let success go to your head. I said, oh yeah, Mom, you know, I read the Reader's Digest too, you know. Like, yeah, thanks, Mom. How original. You don't let success go to your head. She said, shut up. Your mouth is going to get you in trouble. She said, what I meant to say, you don't let success go to your head and you don't let failure go to your heart. And she said, I'll keep your baby while you go off to college. You know, and that's one reason that I never wanted to wrap myself in that victim mantle. I could just walk around worrying about the dirty fingerprints that's been left on my life, or I could define who Loretta was despite them, you know, and that's what I've chosen to do. Now I got professional help, I got some therapy, you know, when I was self-medicating, addicted to drugs and not really seeing to my inner demons and this head. And so I had to get some therapy. I actually hit rock bottom, became addicted to drugs and deeply suicidal before I got smart enough to go get some help. But I'm so glad I did. And and I've been in therapy ever since, 40 years or something like that. Reclaiming my soul, reclaiming my process, but I never want to define myself as anybody's victim. Uh, and and but I'm a survivor. I've experienced things that give me insight on how you can experience the worst things that can happen to you in life. And I ended up co-parenting with my rapist because my son wanted to have a relationship with his dad, and it was easy to do because he was a cousin. You know, so that's the most difficult way to co-parent a child is to have them remind you of the rape every time you look at them. And so my son never got uncomplicated or uncompromised love for me because he was my greatest joy and my greatest horror at the same time. And I'm sorry, I'm going on about my son. He died of a heart attack 5 years ago, and day after tomorrow is his birthday. So April 9th, 1969, that was when I was that scared teenager having a baby. And when they put him in my arms, that's when I went from being a scared teenager to a scared mom. And but without him, I wouldn't be the woman that I am today because I had to take responsibility for this child I chose to keep. And so that's why the victim man, I know you can get victimized, but you have a choice whether you're going to define yourself only by that victim narrative and whether you're going to weaponize your victimhood against other people. And I sometimes get in conversations, I want to call them fights, when people are really wrapped around their victim mantle. Because I actually defended someone who had been wrongly accused of sexual assault. And the woman didn't know anything about my history. And she just came at me. Well, I believe survivors. And obviously you don't believe survivors because I have a story to tell. I said, girlfriend, you do not want competitive oppression stories with me. You know, you really don't want to go there. You know? But I shouldn't have to tell you my competitive oppression story to say that people tell stories based on their trauma. And just because it's their truth, it doesn't make it the truth. And that's why we as human rights activists, we can't deny people due process just because we're triggered by our traumas into I believe survivors. That's not working well for anybody. I'm sorry, didn't mean to go off about it. I'm very emotionally connected to the story of sexual violence in my child and why I believe in calling in right now. It's all connected for me.
Absolutely. I'm so incredibly honored to have you with us today. So grateful for your expertise for your work, but also for your personal experience, for sharing this with us. This has been such a kind of a moving and I think transcendent conversation and experience for us at Fordham. We're so grateful to have had the chance to meet you, to hear your work. I really can't thank you enough for being with us today. And I also, I want to thank everyone who was able to join us today, who joined in the conversation in the chat, who asked questions. I know we didn't get to every question, but I'm grateful also for your engagement. If you would like to continue the conversation with us in the Center for Community Engaged Learning, with the Center for Religion and Culture, who co-sponsored this event, please do reach out to us. I will send a note after this to all panelists, and this has been recorded and will be available.
I want a copy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You will get the first copy. So we'll make that available to everyone as well. And I do want to highlight Professor Ross's website, lorettajross.com. You can get her podcast there. You can also sign up for one of the communities of practice that she described at the end of her talk there. And again, Loretta, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it. Good luck. And the next time I'm up in Queens, I'll come by and see y'all.
Please.
Bye-bye.